Good morning and welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Mark on this Sunday, April the 11th. And again, we have today and the next two Sundays to finish up our consideration of Mark's Gospel. And we'll be continuing this morning from Mark chapter 14, verse 53, immediately after the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And if you'll remember from our discussion last week, after sharing the Last Supper, and instituting the Lord's Supper in the upper room on the night of his betrayal. After Judas has left the room, Jesus and the 11 leave Jerusalem. They cross the Kidron Valley. They go to the Mount of Olives, to this garden that was named Gethsemane. We learn from John's Gospel that this was a familiar place to Jesus and his disciples. They went there often. That's why Judas knew where to lead those who would arrest Jesus to find him. And Jesus has taken the 11 there. He's taken Peter, James, and John a little further into the recesses of the garden to pour out his heart in prayer, agonizing prayer, emotional prayer to the Father. And a verse that I shared with you last week was Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7, which reads, "During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission." Jesus prayed fervently that this cup of suffering, this cup of death might be able to pass from him. Yet if that was the only way that this mission could be accomplished, the only way that mankind could be redeemed from sin, he would take that on himself in our place, as difficult as it was going to be. And Jesus knew just how demanding, how grueling the road was going to be that lay ahead of him. And the one who could save him from death heard his cries. He wasn't spared from death, but he was heard, and he was not alone when he died. And we'll talk about that probably next week. And so after Jesus 3 times has returned to find Peter, James, and John asleep, Judas arrives with those who have come to arrest Jesus. And Mark says in Mark chapter 14, verse 51, "A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind." And as I suggested at the end of class last week, this may be a reference by Mark to Mark himself. None of the other Gospels mentions this. It's a detail that probably only the person that was involved knew about or could have reported to other disciples. And so Jesus is now in custody of those who are wanting to bring him to death. So verse 53 of Mark chapter 14, "They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together." If you read John chapter 18, you find that, first of all, Jesus wasn't taken directly to Caiaphas, the high priest, but was rather taken to his father-in-law, Annas, who had served as high priest previously, and if I'm remembering correctly, would serve as high priest once again after Caiaphas. But because he was still the power behind the power, the one who wielded great influence, Jesus was taken to Annas first and then to Caiaphas. And verse 54, "Peter followed at a distance." Remember, we're told that all the disciples fled, including this disciple on the outskirts of the scene who was wrapped in the linen sheet, who is seized. He leaves the linen sheet behind it, and he runs away naked into the darkness. Even though they scatter, even though the shepherd has been struck and the sheep are scattered, according to Zechariah's prophecy, they begin to follow at a distance. Peter and John, at least, do that. John's gospel tells us that the apostle John was known to the high priest, and we don't know exactly how that came to be, but that's how John gets a little closer to the proceedings. Peter is a little further out, a little further behind, just in the courtyard of where these proceedings were taking place. So Peter follows at a distance. Remember, he has so boastfully said he would never deny the Lord. He would die with him rather than betray him. And when danger came, though he first strikes out with his sword and cuts off the right ear of the high priest's servant, whose name was Malchus, Jesus tells him to put away the sword. And once that is done, Peter flees with the rest. But now he's drawing back closer to the Lord again. He's in the courtyard of the high priest, and there he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. Remember, it's springtime. It's the time of Passover. It's late March. It's early April. It's in the hill country of Judea, the mountains around Jerusalem. And at night, it still gets cold. And so these soldiers, these guards, are warming themselves around a fire, and Peter joins them. I think there's a lesson here as well. If we want to avoid temptation, if we want to stay as far away as possible from evil, we need to be careful about putting ourselves in situations, putting ourselves in proximity to those who might bring temptation about. You remember Joseph and Potiphar's wife. It came to a point where Joseph had to flee. He had to get out of that situation in order to avoid sin. And Peter places himself in a situation where temptation is going to be strong. The opportunities for him to be drawn toward denying Jesus are going to be extremely powerful and difficult to resist. And so we always need to be aware of our environment. If we know of situations that might make our weaknesses susceptible to yielding to sin, we need to extract ourselves from those situations. Peter warms himself by a fire that has been kindled by the enemies of Jesus, and that's when ultimately these questions are going to come to him. Verse 55, the chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus, and so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Notice it says they're looking for evidence. They're grasping at straws because there is no evidence against Jesus of anything that was deserving of death. They've, however, arrived at the conclusion they want to reach. They've already determined what the verdict is going to be. They just have to concoct some supporting evidence. It's just entirely backwards in regard to a system of justice. This is rife with injustice. And it's like a mathematical problem. You go ahead and determine the answer that you want, the number you want to arrive at, and then you just backfill the equation, backfill the math that will get you to that particular answer. That's exactly what they're doing here, but their ineptitude is running so high that even these false witnesses that they bring together can't get their stories together. Their statements don't even agree. Verse 57, then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Yet even their testimony did not agree. And why it didn't agree was that they are misquoting Jesus in an extreme fashion. And they were taking something that Jesus had said, and they're molding it into all different kinds of forms, and they can't even agree on what form that statement was. One of the places where Jesus had made this statement was in John chapter 2. This was after the first cleansing of the temple, very early on in Jesus's ministry. And once he cleanses the temple of the merchandisers and the money changers, he's challenged, verse 18 of John chapter 2. The Jews then responded to him, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this? Who are you? Who do you think you are? And how can you turn the status quo of the temple on its head? Jesus answered, destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days. That's what Jesus said. Destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it again. John goes on to explain that after the death and burial and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, his disciples recalled what he had said, and they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. He was talking about the temple of his body. The Jews heard him say that he was going to destroy Zerubbabel's temple, the second temple, Herod's temple, that at that point had been under renovation and reconstruction for 46 years. So by the time Jesus is on trial, another 3 years have passed, 49 years, almost a half a century, that the temple has been undergoing these renovations and this reconstruction that had begun by the efforts of Herod the Great. And so he says he's going to destroy this temple made with hands and to build one not made with hands. And they can't even get their story straight on that one. So the high priest stands up before them and asks Jesus, this is verse 60, are you going to answer? Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? Jesus has said nothing to this point. All these false witnesses that can't agree, this statement about destroying the temple and raising again, Jesus hasn't responded at all. He has nothing, there's no need to defend himself. It's nothing but lies. So the high priest asked him, what is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Isaiah 53:7, like a sheep is silent before its shearers, and like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, so would the suffering servant of God be. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Just a pointed question. And so Jesus just answers very simply, I am. And again, understand its theological significance. It's not like someone saying, Tim, are you the preaching minister at the Broken Arrow Church of Christ? And I say, I am. When Jesus says, I am, as it's recorded in Greek, ego eimi, this is the divine name, a reference to God's telling Moses, I am who I am. I am that I am, the self-existent one. And Jesus' statement in John 8:58, I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. And I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. So Jesus says, I am. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And this, he hasn't said anything up to this point, but this is enough for them to just wrap everything up and go on to the verdict that has been predetermined anyway. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need more witnesses? He asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Be careful about using words like no one and everyone and never and always. There was a perception that this was unanimous, but we know from other scripture that it wasn't. We learn from Luke's gospel that Joseph of Arimathea, who comes to claim the body of Jesus, John in his gospel tells us that Joseph was a secret disciple of Jesus. Luke tells us that he was a good man, a devout man. He was a member of this council. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, and he had not consented to their plans. He had not consented to this verdict that was brought against Jesus. So not, at least one was not voting in favor of this. They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him. Notice at this point, he's suffering at the hands of his fellow Jews. They spit at him, they blindfolded him, and then struck him with their fists. I've never had someone spit in my face. I had a few scuffles growing up. I've never been hit full in the face with someone's fist. And yet they've blindfolded Jesus. They're striking him with their fist. and mockingly asking him to prophesy, "Tell us, who is the one who hit you?" The guards took him and beat him. While this is going on, Peter is still out in the courtyard. And I don't know if he can now hear the sounds of the abuse that is being enacted against Jesus. But while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. Now remember, it's in the middle of the night. It's dark. There's the glow of a fire. And so she has to look carefully at him. It's not like looking someone a few feet away in broad daylight. She has to sort of examine his face. And she said, "You were with that Nazarene. You also were with that Nazarene Jesus." But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said. And he went out into the entryway. Maybe as he had been sitting there, he began to worry about the setting in which he was, the surroundings where he had placed himself, these enemies of Jesus. And maybe he had started to think, I hope no one says anything. I hope no one asks me any questions, because this was not a place where he belonged. This is not familiar territory to him. He didn't want to be conspicuous. He didn't want to stand out. And now he's been noticed. And he denies it and sort of moves a little bit into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denied it. And I don't think this is happening in quick succession, within 5 or 6 minutes, these 3 denials. It's probably spread out over a period of time. And after the first denial, he had to have felt something in his conscience, some disappointment in himself, some grief in himself. Why did I do that? Why was I not strong? And before he can figure out why he wasn't strong enough, the accusation comes again and again. He denies it. Verse 70, again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near, not the servant girl this time, but others said, "Surely you are one of them, for you're a Galilean." Most of the people there were native Judeans, either by his accent in his reply or his dress. It was apparent that he was from Galilee, where Jesus was from. He began to call down curses. Peter called down curses and swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." And immediately the rooster crowed. Some manuscripts of Mark say the second time. You may have a footnote in your NIV that says, some manuscripts just say that the rooster crowed, as the other gospels say. And when he hears that sound, and you think about it, I know that just as Jesus had told Peter, before all of this, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat, but I've prayed for you so that when you've repented, you can restore your brothers. When you have turned, you will restore your brothers. Even though after his powerful preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and as time went on, I'm sure that the sound of a rooster in the morning hopefully bothered him less and less throughout the rest of his life, knowing that he had been forgiven of his failure, forgiven for his denials. But I would imagine that took a long time. Can you imagine dreading in the darkness every morning the sound of a rooster crowing, because it would remind him of what he had done? So when the rooster crows the second time, Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." Luke 22:61 says that the Lord looked at Peter. He looked straight at him. Their eyes met. And you know what that can do to you. Why do we try to avoid eye contact with people? Because there's something that we know will make us uncomfortable there. There's something we don't want to have to face, something we don't want to have to reckon with. And yet Peter comes face to face. He makes eye contact with Jesus, and that's when he breaks down and goes out and weeps bitterly. Now, remember, all of this has been taking place throughout the hours of the night. No one gets any sleep, and Jesus not only doesn't get any sleep, he suffers this physical and this emotional and this verbal abuse from the Sanhedrin, from the chief priest and the elders. Very early in the morning, this is chapter 15, verse 1. Very early in the morning, the chief priest and the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. They bound Jesus, they led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. So I don't know what Pilate had planned for that day. It is the Passover. There is this tradition of releasing a prisoner to the people, but this was not a situation that Pilate was prepared for. This wasn't on the docket of cases for that day. So they bring him to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and he asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And the only reason this would have been relayed to Pilate by the enemies of Jesus would be to try to cause him to think that Jesus was some sort of political threat. This man claims to be the king of the Jews, and you as a Roman officer, you as a Roman commander and a Roman official need to be worried about that. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priest in front of Pilate accused Jesus of many things. No response, no reply from Jesus. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." Pilate undoubtedly was well familiar with people who were accused of crimes, and the natural inclination of both the guilty and the innocent is to defend themselves, to say those things aren't true. Innocent people justly do that. Guilty people unjustly and dishonestly do that. But here's the most innocent man who has ever lived, one who has never sinned, the perfect, spotless Lamb of God, and he doesn't defend himself against these accusations. Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. He's never seen someone in custody. He's never seen a prisoner fail to defend himself. Verse 6, "Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising." It wasn't just that he was among the insurrectionists who had committed murder. The other gospels make it plain Barabbas himself was a murderer. And you can imagine, I don't know how long this custom had been there, but the Roman officials had figured out that they could gain the favor of the people, sort of increase the percentage of their popularity among the people by doing something that would please them. And since Passover, the Feast of Passover was a commemoration of release from Egypt, deliverance from slavery for the Jews. There's that natural connection with, well, let's take someone who is in custody, let's take someone who is bound and release them in sort of the Roman secular acknowledgement of this religious feast of the Jews. So the crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "It's that time again, Pilate, time to release a prisoner to us. And do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" Maybe he was hopeful here. Maybe even though the religious leaders seemed so intent on destroying Jesus, when some of the people came up, maybe he thought they want Jesus released. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priest had handed him over to him? He knows that this man has done nothing worthy of being in custody, worthy of punishment, worthy of death. But the crowd was led by the chief priest and the other religious leaders to demand Barabbas. The chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. Even among those who may have been somewhat inclined because of their knowledge of Jesus, their respect for him. Remember, it hasn't been but just a few days since he entered the city with great celebration and great jubilation. But the chief priest lobby the crowd. They campaign among the crowd. They get busy politicking among the crowd, bending their ear, bending their will to demand the release of Barabbas, which they do. What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. And they want Barabbas released. Sadly, the world still cries for Barabbas, rejects Jesus and cries out for Barabbas in so many different forms, so many different fashions. They choose the things of this world over the things of God. They ask for the release of a murderer rather than the release of the author of life. They ask for the release of one who takes human life rather than the one who can restore human life. As he had raised Lazarus, as he had raised Jairus' daughter, as he had raised the son of the widow at Nain. And so that's just such a stark contrast to me. The crowd demands the one who kills rather than the one who gives life, wishing to satisfy the crowd. Caving to public opinion, caving to the consensus of people around him, and not wanting to offend them, not wanting to anger them, knowing what was right, and yet still not doing it because of pressure around him, wanting to satisfy the crowd. Pilate released Barabbas to them, and he had Jesus flogged. He had Jesus scourged, and then he handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. Notice now these are Roman soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews." And this is just so painful to read when you think about what Jesus suffered for us. The only reason he is willing to do this, he could have called legions of angels. He could have, with his own divine power, which in regard to humans, he is only used to heal and to restore life. It would have been at his disposal to protect himself with the divine power that he had. He can still storms. He has power over the elements of the earth. Roman soldiers are no match for him, and yet he restrains himself in exerting any power to protect himself, subjects himself to this simply for me, simply for you, so that we wouldn't have to pay the penalty for our sins. Again and again, how many times Mark doesn't say, but he gives us the impression that it seemed like it was never going to stop. Again and again, they struck him on the head with a staff. Remember, there is a crown of thorns on his head. They struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they mocked him, they took off the purple robe, put his clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. Let's go ahead and read through verse 24, and then I think we'll wrap up for today. We'll read and discuss the rest of Mark's crucifixion account next Sunday, including a discussion of all 7 statements that Jesus makes while on the cross. Mark, like Matthew, will only record one of those, but I think it's important that we try to get the fullness of what the Gospels present about those 6 hours that Jesus spent on the cross. So as he is being led away to be crucified, a certain man from Cyrene in modern-day Libya, North Africa, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, and the Gospels that mention this man mention him in such a way that he must have been known to the disciples. It's generally felt that Simon became a Christian. He had 2 sons who were among the Christian community, ultimately, Alexander and Rufus. Otherwise, we would have just been told that a man was pressed into service to carry the cross of Jesus. It seems significant that his name is mentioned. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country. They are on their way out of the city of Jerusalem to the place of the skull. He's just walking into the city. And the Gospels don't specifically tell us that Jesus stumbled, that he fell, that because of that, this man was pressed into service. But it's a fair assumption that given the abuse Jesus had suffered, given the scourging, the flogging that he had endured, which sometimes was fatal in and of itself, with the loss of blood, with the damage that had been done to his body, it became apparent he wasn't going to be able to carry that crossbar, the patibulum, out to the place of crucifixion. And so they forced him into service to carry Jesus's cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Cranion, from which we get cranium, is the Greek word for skull. Calva is the Latin name for either a bare head, a bald head, or a skull. And it is from the Latin word that the word Calvary comes. If you read your NIV and you read all 4 crucifixion accounts, you consistently find this place referred to as Golgotha, the place of the skull. And you may wonder, since we sing so many songs about Calvary, where does that word come from? Well, it appears in the King James Version in Luke 23:33. They took him to the place called Calvary, and that was based on the Latin translation rather than from the Greek text. So the meaning of the word is the same. It's just the Latin word rather than the Greek word. And so that explains why we have so many songs that reference Calvary. It's from that one verse, Luke 23:33 in the King James Version. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. There are fewer, more grueling scenes that we can imagine than that of laying a human body upon a cross of wood and taking spikes, taking nails, and attaching that human body to that wood with those spikes, with those nails, driving them through human flesh and bone into wood. Mark doesn't have to explain the process. In fact, none of the Gospels do. They don't describe the sound of the hammer against the spikes and the nails, or the excruciating cries of pain and the gasps of other people around. It was sadly common knowledge what was involved in crucifixion. And so Mark just succinctly says, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. We'll begin next week with verse 25 of Mark chapter 15, and we'll go back and we'll look at Psalm 22 that mentions this dividing up his clothes and the casting of lots. We'll look at Isaiah 53. We'll look at Psalm 22 in regard their prophecies of the suffering that Jesus would endure for us. Thank you so much for being a part of the study today. Again, we look forward to our time of worship together at 10 o'clock, whether that's in person in the auditorium or through the live stream on the YouTube channel. Thanks again for devoting this time to focus on the Word of God, and I hope that you have a blessed rest of the day.